let's look at the specific sampling techniques that can be used. First of all, we have Snowball and convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is sampling without specified criteria. The only criterion in the sampling is that the unit needs to be part of the population. Apart from that, the researcher just picks units to sample as is convenient, for example, because it's easy or cost-effective. An example would be a researcher who wants to study the blame game in the news media around a current international diplomatic dispute. And the researcher happens to have a subscription to Aftenposten, a major newspaper in Norway. So the researcher simply collects all news items in Aftenposten that deal with that specific international diplomatic dispute and analyzes those because it's convenient. Another example, you're interested in which drivers drive carefully and which drive recklessly. You conduct an observation study in the street you live in since you want to make observations every day and don't want to spend a lot of time to travel to your observation location. It's not the best location certainly for that study, or not a well considered location, but first of all, practical matters dominate what you do. Very often when you are in the position of collecting units, you are doing something very much like convenience sampling, which is snowball sampling. This is where the researcher picks one or several units belonging to the population as starting points. Very often people they already know, they are familiar with that, they have an easy time approaching. So this is convenience. And those units then provide the next batch of units to include. That can be people who mention other people who could be good participants in the study, or documents like a few news stories that point to other documents or incidents that they link to and that you could then take as the next batch. Right? Example, you forward an invitation to participate in a survey study to all your contacts on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and LinkedIn, and you ask people to forward the invitation to their contacts as well. The dangers of such a procedure are that snowball and convenience samples generally are the least desirable if you pursue such a microcosm sampling approach. So they generally can't create a microcosm unless it is a very specific one. For instance, your friends might be a good way to get a microcosm of your friends and family. Just generally, people you know and people you can easily reach out to are different. They have something in common that's not universal. There's some reason why you know them and why it's easy for you to reach out to them. I'm not saying anything about what these reasons are, but certainly there must be something that differentiates them from other people. Therefore, convenience and snowball samples are biased by default. For university students, for instance, it's quite likely that these people are very highly educated and very politically interested compared to just a general sample of the population. And that is what makes things worse. People tend towards building homogeneous social networks in various social characteristics, and that includes characteristics that we know have many effects on behavior and worldviews, demographics and ideology, for instance. The sample is highly likely to be systematically skewed to be more similar to the starting points in terms of these central characteristics. You can imagine your contacts subjects tend to be younger, better educated, more politically interested, etc. than the general population. According to the proverbs, birds of a feather flock together. Okay, but nevertheless, is there a possibility to use such samples? Yes, other kinds of samples are generally preferable. However, in experimental research, the composition of the sample you're studying is usually of secondary importance, and the randomization into experimental conditions creates comparability between the different conditions. So the groups are similar in the beginning because you randomly distribute your sample into the experimental conditions. The only problem is if the mechanisms under study are likely to differ substantially with certain observed or unobserved variables, there is a danger of drawing false conclusions. For example, in medical studies, there was a tendency to only recruit, for instance, only male white participants for studies, to just have a relatively homogeneous sample and not introduce too much variation based on these background variables. However, that led, because some medical conditions function differently and need to be treated differently depending on your sex or depending on your skin color, basically, your ethnic background. That means that we used medication that is designed for white males to treat black females, for instance. And that wasn't the best treatment for them because research didn't consider the diversity of the sample and didn't bother to study alternative populations. So population can matter in an experiment, but generally the group differences are the important thing, and convenience samples are much more permissible in that context. To be even more specific, for human reflexes as a general mechanism that will probably not systematically vary with other variables, we can very well look at how alcohol consumption affects reflexes, even if the sample isn't a microcosm of the entire population. We can, to some degree, assume that all people react more or less similarly because it's a biological thing. Other mechanisms where your belief system or life experiences play a bigger role. A too homogeneous sample may cause problems when trying to generalize. Then you will have to look for other samples of other subgroups or test it with a more diverse sample. So I present a little simulation of data under the conditions of different samples. So think of a characteristic we want to sample. Say how politically interested individuals are. Say this purple distribution here is the actual distribution that we don't know before the study, but let's presume we know it. This is how that feature of political interest is distributed in the entire population. And then we draw a sample, and we draw a snowball sample. Because we have specific starting points in our sample that are more or less dependent on who we are sympathetic with or who we sympathize with, we almost by default will get deviations, systematic deviations, biases between the actual mean and the actual distribution, and the sample mean and the sample distribution, right? So you just have politically more interested people in your in-group, and because you sample in the Snowball methodology, this is what generally holds in your sample and evokes a false impression for the entire population. Good, and that illustrates that snowball sampling is not a good procedure if you want this microcosm idea. And it's not really important whether there is unobserved variables in which a bias occurs or clusters that include a bias. It just generally creates a bias.